My name is Bentley. I am 50 years old, and for most of my life, I lived in shadows. A man carrying a secret so heavy that even those closest to me could never imagine the truth. People knew me as a quiet neighbor, a man of few words, someone who lived simply and without much noise. But beneath the surface was a past I had buried deep, a past that would one day resurface in the most unexpected of places, inside a courtroom. Standing before a judge whose eyes told me he knew exactly who I was, even though no one else in that room did. It was supposed to be a routine hearing, another case among thousands that passed through the system. Lawyers shuffled papers, clerks whispered instructions, and the air was filled with the stale heaviness of bureaucracy. But then, as I stepped forward, the room changed. The judge froze. His hand, mid-motion, stopped trembling in the air. Silence rippled through the chamber. People shifted uncomfortably in their seats, confused by his sudden reaction. They didn't understand. How could they? To them, I was just another man standing trial. But to him, I was something else entirely. That moment was not about the charges, the lawyers, or the case at hand. It was about recognition. About a hidden story that spanned decades, crossing borders, touching lives, and leaving behind scars no one could see. The judge's eyes weren't just startled, they were haunted. He remembered. He knew. And in that silent recognition, my entire past threatened to unravel before the world. What happened next is a story of identity, of choices made in the darkest hours, and of a truth that refuses to stay buried. When the gavel first struck the block that morning, it should have been a routine day. Courtrooms are places of repetition, of motions and hearings that follow one another like trains on a schedule. Yet for me, the air felt different from the moment I stepped inside. The walls carried the weight of history. Marble columns, the faded scent of polished wood, the echoes of countless verdicts spoken over the years. I walked in quietly, my shoes tapping against the stone floor, and tried to remain invisible as I always had. But that day, invisibility was impossible. Because as soon as the judge's eyes landed on me, the carefully constructed mask I had worn for half a lifetime began to crack. He froze. His lips parted slightly as though he had seen a ghost, and in many ways, he had. For in his eyes, I wasn't the man standing there accused. I was someone else. Someone from a past neither of us could escape. The silence in that room stretched thin, fragile as glass, threatening to shatter at any second. Lawyers shuffled papers, unaware of the storm brewing in that gaze. The bailiff looked on, puzzled, waiting for the judge to resume. But he didn't. He stared at me as if the years between us had collapsed, dragging both of us back to a place we had hoped to bury forever. In that instant, I felt my chest tighten with the weight of memory. I had lived so long believing I had escaped it, believing my new name, my quiet existence. My careful distance from the world had been enough to erase what came before. But secrets don't vanish. They wait, silent and patient until the right set of eyes finds them again. To understand the depth of that moment, you would need to know the roads I walked before arriving at that courthouse. You would need to see the world as I saw it decades earlier, when my choices were shaped not by desire, but by survival. I was not always Bentley, the quiet man who lived in a modest house at the edge of town. Long before the gray streaked my hair and time slowed my steps, I lived under another name, in another place, in another time where chaos reigned and trust was a luxury few could afford. I was a different man then, a man drawn into the orbit of violence and secrecy, a man whose life was defined not by laws but by the necessity of breaking them. The judge and I had once shared that world, not as friends, not even as allies, but as men entangled in the same storm. He wore a different uniform, a different role, yet his eyes betrayed the same burden I carried. It was a time when nations tore themselves apart, when lines between right and wrong blurred beneath the weight of survival, and when men like us had to become shadows to endure. I can still recall the smell of the streets, then smoke and metal, the bitter stench of fear clinging to every corner. I remember the way the night stretched endlessly, filled with whispers of betrayal, the crack of gunfire, the low hum of engines carrying men to destinations they would never return from. That was the world we lived in, a world so far removed from the sterile quiet of a courtroom that it felt almost unreal to see him sitting there in robes of authority, as though the past had never existed. But it had. For me, it existed every day. I had built my life carefully, layer by layer, ensuring no one could trace the man I had been. I never spoke of it, never hinted. Even my closest companions, the few I dared to let near, never knew the truth. To them, I was simply Bentley, reserved, private, perhaps a little haunted, but ordinary. They didn't know the nights I woke, drenched in sweat, heart racing with memories of places I could never return to. They didn't know how often I walked the streets in silence, scanning faces, waiting for the moment recognition might strike. And they certainly didn't know the one man who could unravel it all was now seated before me, holding my fate in his hands. When his gaze locked with mine, I saw not only shock, but also fear. Not fear of me, but of what I represented, the past he too had buried. His jaw tightened as he tried to compose himself to hide the storm behind the mask of judicial control. But it was too late. I had seen it and he had seen me. We were bound again, unwillingly pulled back into the same story, one neither of us had ever fully escaped. The case at hand was meaningless compared to what lingered unspoken between us. The others in the room may have thought this was about charges, evidence, testimony, and verdicts. But for us, it was about survival of a different kind. Survival. Of secrets, of reputations, of carefully built lives that could collapse with a single revelation. I kept my head still, my expression calm, though inside I was unraveling. Every heartbeat echoed like a drum, pounding reminders of moments I had tried desperately to silence. I remembered the first time I crossed his path, in a world where uniforms dictated life and death. He was younger then, harder in some ways, but his eyes were the same, sharp, observant, carrying both resolve and doubt. I remembered the night we were caught in the same corridor of fate, forced to make choices that would stain us forever. Choices no one in that courtroom would have believed if I told them. Choices that turned us from ordinary men into survivors, though survival came at a price too heavy to name. And now here we were. Decades later, surrounded by the sterile order of the law, pretending to be men of different worlds. He, the respected judge whose words carried the weight of justice. Me, the quiet defendant accused of something so minor compared to the life I had lived that it almost felt absurd. Yet the absurdity made it worse, because I knew this wasn't about the charges anymore. It was about recognition, about truth clawing its way back into the light. He tried to mask it, to continue to recite the formalities of the court. But his voice wavered, his hand trembled slightly as he adjusted his glasses, and for anyone paying attention, it was clear something unusual was happening. I stood there breathing slowly, my mind racing through possibilities. Should I reveal the truth? Should I confront him? Should I pretend ignorance and hope he would bury it once again? Every option carried danger. To speak would be to risk everything I had built. To remain silent meant living with the uncertainty of whether he would remain silent too. In that moment, I understood that the real trial was not the one written on the docket. The real trial was the silent battle between two men who shared a past too dangerous to name. The seconds dragged like hours. I could feel the weight of the room pressing against me, the invisible tension that no one else could sense but him and me. Behind his glasses, his eyes searched mine as if asking a question neither of us dared to voice. Did I remember? Would I expose him? Would I force the past into the present, tearing down the fragile walls we had both constructed? I held his gaze unflinching, offering no answers. Only silence. Only the same silence that had kept me alive for all these years. And then, finally, he blinked. He lowered his eyes, shuffled the papers before him, and forced his voice steady again. The trial moved forward, the motions resumed, and for those unaware, the moment passed unnoticed. But between us, the truth had been spoken in silence. He knew, I knew, and nothing could ever erase that. When the court adjourned that day, people filed out with the same indifferent shuffle they always carried. Unaware that something extraordinary had happened between the walls of that chamber, for them it was just another hearing, another man standing accused, another judge overseeing the process of law. But for me, stepping out into the sunlight, the air felt heavier than iron. My past had been stirred, and once stirred, it never lay still again. I could feel it pressing against my ribs, demanding to be remembered, demanding to be told. And as I walked down the courthouse steps, I realized the life I had built was more fragile than I had ever imagined. The mask I had worn for decades could be torn away in an instant if he chose to speak. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat by the window in the dim light of a street lamp, staring at the shadows stretching across the pavement, and the memories came uninvited. They never ask permission. Memories like these, they barge in, carrying the smell of smoke, the ringing of sirens, the low hum of voices speaking in hushed urgency. I remembered the years when the world seemed to crack apart, when young men were pulled into wars not always of their choosing. When survival meant learning to adapt, to deceive, to shed old skins and wear new ones. I had worn many names before I became Bentley, and one of those names was the reason the judge had frozen when he saw me. I was only 19 when I first learned what it meant to live a double life. The world was different then, scarred by conflict that carved deep lines across continents. I had been born into a family that valued loyalty. Yet loyalty was a dangerous thing when the tides of power shifted overnight. My father had been a man of quiet conviction, but conviction can be fatal when it runs against the grain of those in command. I watched him vanish one evening, taken by men who did not wear uniforms but carried the authority of fear. He never returned, and from that night, I understood that survival required silence, and silence required disguise. I drifted through those early years, like a shadow, learning the skills of those who lived in the margins. Forged papers, whispered codes, faces changed by nothing more than a different haircut, a new set of clothes, the right accent. These became my weapons. I was not strong, but I was adaptable, and adaptability is the currency of survival. It was during those years that I first crossed paths with the man who would one day sit as judge over me. Back then, he was no judge. He was a young officer, sharp in uniform, stern in demeanor, and loyal to a system that demanded obedience above all else. Our encounter had not been one of choice. It was forced by circumstance, as many encounters in those days were. I had been moving through a city torn apart by division, carrying documents meant to pass me safely through checkpoints. But the papers were not perfect, and his eyes were trained to spot imperfections. He stopped me, questioned me, studied me with that same piercing gaze he carried into old age. For a moment, I thought my life was over, that I would join the countless others who vanished into the night, never to be seen again. But fate is strange, and chance plays its own games. Something in him hesitated. Maybe it was the way I answered his questions. Maybe it was the flicker of doubt in his own heart. But instead of turning me in, he let me pass. That should have been the end of it. But war has a way of pulling people back into each other's orbits. Months later, our paths crossed again, this time under circumstances that bound us far tighter than either of us would have chosen. A mission gone wrong, a sudden clash in the darkened streets. And we found ourselves trapped together in a crumbling building as gunfire rattled the windows. Enemies surrounded us, and in that night of fire and chaos, survival became our shared goal. Whatever uniforms we wore, whatever sides we claimed, it meant nothing compared to the simple truth. We would either both die or both live. We lived, not because we trusted each other, but because necessity made allies of us. We fought our way out, shoulders pressed against the same walls, breaths held in the same shadows, fear etched in the same silence. In those hours, something unspoken was forged between us. Not friendship, not even respect, but recognition. He knew then, as I knew, that we were both men caught in the machinery of forces larger than ourselves. We both carried secrets. We both carried shame. and we both carried blood on our hands. When the war shifted and borders changed, we parted ways. He returned to his country to rebuild under the banner of law and order. I disappeared, shedding another name, taking another identity, crossing oceans until I became someone else entirely. Decades passed. I learned to live quietly, to blend into the fabric of normal life. I became Bentley. I told no one of the man I had been, of the night I fought beside an enemy officer, of the blood that tied us together in silence. I thought the past had been buried beneath years of distance, time eroding the sharp edges of memory. But memory does not erode. It waits, and now, in that courtroom, it had returned. When his eyes froze upon me, I saw that same night reflected back, the same recognition, the same unspoken knowledge that neither of us could escape. He had built his life into respectability, authority, even honor. I had built mine into anonymity, survival, obscurity. Yet here we were, the past collapsing the walls we had constructed. As I sat in my dimly lit room that night, I wondered what he would do. Would he reveal me? Would he use my identity to destroy me, to protect himself, to control the narrative before it controlled him? Or would he keep the silence we had both chosen long ago? The question gnawed at me as sharp as any blade, because I knew that one word from him could shatter everything. But I also knew something else. Secrets bind as tightly as chains. If he revealed me, he would reveal himself too. To admit who I was would be to admit who he had been. And the world he had so carefully crafted around himself would collapse as surely as mine. That was the strange bond between us. Our silence was mutual destruction. And so it became our mutual protection. Still, the uncertainty lingered. Days passed, and each time I walked the streets, I wondered if today would be the day the past caught me. Each time I opened a letter, I expected it to carry words that would end me. Each time the phone rang, I feared it would be his voice, breaking the silence at last. But it never came. He said nothing, and so did I. Yet the silence did not bring peace. It brought reflection, endless nights replaying the choices of my youth. I thought of my father, who had vanished because he refused to bend. I thought of the faces of men I had fought beside. Men who had never seen 50. Men who would never sit by a window in quiet reflection. And I thought of the man who now wore robes of justice, whose eyes had once judged me in the shadows of war, and now judged me in the light of the law. The world outside believed in clean lines, guilt and innocence, truth and lies, justice and crime. But the world I had lived in was not made of clean lines. It was made of shadows, of compromises, of choices that carried no purity. And perhaps that was why, when the judge looked at me that day, he froze. Because he knew as well as I did that justice was not so simple, that beneath the surface of law lay the chaos of memory. And that men like us would never fit neatly into the stories written by history. Weeks passed after that first day in court, yet the weight of it never left me. Each morning when I rose, washed my face, and looked into the mirror, I wondered not just who I was, but who I had been. The lines across my skin, the gray in my beard, the heaviness in my shoulders. They were not simply signs of age, but records of a life lived in silence. To the world, I was Bentley, 50 years old, a man who carried himself quietly and spoke little. But to him, the judge, I was a ghost. I was proof that the past was never truly gone. Every appearance in court after that became a silent duel. He would enter in his robes, dignified, carrying the authority of the law. He would call the proceedings, address the lawyers, maintain the order expected of his position. But then his eyes would find mine, and in that moment, the veneer of order cracked. No words were ever spoken between us, no acknowledgement shared, but the tension lingered like a storm cloud above the chamber. For the others in the room, nothing unusual was happening. But for us, each glance was heavy with the unspoken. The building where we had hidden from gunfire. The blood on the stones. The desperate pact of survival. Those moments lived between us, sharp and unyielding. While the rest of the world moved on in blissful ignorance, I often wondered what his nights were like after seeing me again. Did he sleep? Did he sit by his own window, haunted by the same shadows that haunted me? Or had he managed to bury it more deeply than I could? His life, after all, had been shaped into order, into respectability. The world looked at him and saw a man of law, a man trusted with judgment. No one questioned his integrity, his past, his path to the bench. And yet I knew the truth. I knew the nights he had once lived, the blood he had once seen, the compromises he had once made. Perhaps that was the cruelest bond between us, that we carried the same shame. Yet only one of us had been able to turn it into honor. The case itself, the very reason Tia had been dragged into that courtroom, seemed laughably small compared to the weight of what lay unspoken. A dispute over money, a mistake on paper, the kind of thing that should have passed quietly with a fine or a warning. But life rarely unfolds in neat chapters. Instead, it was this trivial matter that pulled the past into the present, that set me face to face once more with the man who held my survival in his gaze. Every word spoken in that courtroom felt secondary to the silence between us. Each time the gavel struck, it was not just a call for order. It was an echo of the gunfire that had once dictated our every breath. And then came the day the verdict would be read. I remember walking into that chamber with a heart that pounded like a drum, my palms damp with sweat, though the air was cold. People filled the benches, lawyers stacked their files neatly before them, and the bailiff called the room to order. But my eyes were only on him, the judge, the man whose decision would not only settle the matter at hand, but might also decide the fate of my carefully constructed life. He sat with his papers before him, glasses perched on his nose, his face unreadable to the untrained eye. But I had learned to read him long ago, in the shadows of that war-torn night. And what I saw was not just a judge preparing to deliver judgment. I saw a man wrestling with himself, a man who carried the same burden of silence I did. When his eyes lifted to mine, there was a flicker, a momentary tremor of recognition, not just of who I was, but of what he would choose to do. The courtroom waited as he began to speak. His voice was steady, measured, the practiced tone of authority. He spoke of the law of evidence, of responsibility. But beneath those words, I heard something else, the faint echo of the past. He could have exposed me. He could have pulled away the mask of Bentley and revealed the man I had once been, tearing my life apart in front of all those present. He could have judged me not only for the matter at hand, but for every hidden act I had carried through those years of fire and blood. But he didn't. Instead, he chose silence. He delivered the verdict with finality, addressing the case with the authority expected of him, but nothing more. No revelation. No exposure. No destruction. To the others in that room, it was just another judgment, one of countless that had passed through his court. But to me, it was everything. Because in choosing silence, he had chosen survival for both of us. I left the courthouse that day with a strange mixture of relief and weight. Relief, because my secret remained intact. Weight, because I knew now with certainty that he remembered. And as long as he remembered, the past was never truly gone. The bond between us would remain unspoken but unbreakable for as long as we both lived, as the weeks turned into months. I found myself reflecting more often on the nature of identity. Who was I, truly? Was I Bentley, the quiet man of 50, the neighbor who nodded politely on the street? Or was I the shadow of my youth, the man who had once lived on the edge of survival, who had carried forged papers and hidden in ruined buildings, who had shared a night of fire with a man now cloaked in robes of justice? Perhaps I was both. Perhaps we are all the sum of every name we have carried, every choice we have made, every silence we have kept. The judge and I never spoke of it, never exchanged words outside of those formal proceedings. And yet, in a way, I felt I knew him more deeply than anyone else alive, because we shared something unspeakable. We had both been shaped by the same storm, both carried scars that could never be shown, both learned to live in silence. That silence was our prison, but it was also our protection. I sometimes wondered what history would say of men like us if history ever knew the truth. Would it call us cowards for hiding our pasts? Would it call us survivors for enduring when others did not? Would it see us as villains Or simply as men caught in the machinery of forces larger than ourselves? The truth is, history does not care for the complexity of shadows. It prefers clean lines, heroes and villains, guilt and innocence. But life is not made of clean lines. Life is made of choices in the dark, of compromises that haunt us, silence that protects us even as it eats away at us. And so I live still as Bentley. 50 years old, carrying my secret like a stone in my chest. The world sees a quiet man, ordinary, unremarkable. But in the silence of my nights, I remember. I remember the judge's eyes freezing in recognition. I remember the night we survived together. I remember the man I was before I became this name. And though I will never speak it aloud, though no one will ever know, I carry it with me always. Some truths are too heavy for words. Some stories live only in the silence between two men who can never tell them. And that is my story. The story of the day the judge froze in court when he saw me because he knew, as I knew, that our secret identities were bound forever in silence.